know, the reason you're here is we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the Parkland tragedy. And we feel that this is an opportunity to continue to uplift the work that many of you have been doing for years, decades, and will continue to do post this moment. But it's an opportunity for us, again, to have a conversation in the media and amongst each other about the voice of young people of color and what safety means to us. And so we wanted to create a space to provide some tools, talk a little bit about messaging, provide opportunities for folks to actually have added supports to be able to intervene into that narrative, and for participants to learn some new practices for writing, pitching, and placing op-eds. So most of this webinar is going to be focused on op-eds placement and a little bit on messaging. I do want to acknowledge there is a team of amazing folks that are still in the weeds of pulling together an amazing toolkit that will launch early next week that you can use, and we'll have an opportunity to preview some of that toolkit. But in the meantime, we'll preview some of the messaging points for the toolkit and some of the tweets that we might want to be sharing. So Hashim, do you want to share the poll results? Northeast Mid-Atlantic looks like our high point, 28%. Most of you are youth organizing groups. And we're split all over. Thanks for participating in that, folks. That was really fun. So again, still feel free to continue to chat. Folks will be monitoring the chat. We'll have a time for Q&A at the end. Not a lot of time, I'm going to be real honest. But if you have questions, please feel free to chat them and we'll try to get to them as best we can. And at this point, I'm just going to hand it over to Jennifer to not waste any time and to jump right into our training. So it's all you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica, and hello, everyone. Thanks for giving us a part of your evening on this Wednesday night. I want to share a presentation, and what I'll do is I'll walk through a few slides, and then I'll answer any questions that you have. There will be a few pauses for you to ask questions. If you have questions, you can also put them in the chat feature, and hopefully Monica or Allie or someone else can help me monitor that feature. So one second.
Hey everyone, just noting a comment that's in the chat to make sure that we go slow for some folks that are getting interpretation tonight.
Great, thank you for that, that reminder, Kate. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have been in the public relations, strategic communications field for about 17 years. And every year that number grows. So at some point it's just going to be capped at like 17, or, if you guys meet me in 5 years, it'll be like 10 or something. And we'll just play along and pretend that's okay. I've been working with social and racial justice organizations for my entire career, and I wrote about my experience promoting different campaigns in a book called Extraordinary PR, Ordinary Budget. And basically I highlighted work that I've done with Tenants and Workers United, work that I've done on the school to prison pipeline with Padres and Jóvenes Unidos in Colorado, and voting rights work. So the book is really a how-to guide for people like you. I am also the owner of a small PR firm. It's called Spotlight PR. And the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing is actually one of my clients. So thank you. And then I also write a lot about public relations and communications on my personal website, jenniferrfarmer.org. So if you ever want information on how to just improve your writing, how to improve your public relations, or how to improve your message about yourself, you can always go to my personal website. In addition to my media relations work, I've also done some writing for celebrities such as Jesse Williams and also Amber P. Riley. She used to write on Glee, or she used to be on Glee. And Killer Mike, Michael Render Killer Mike, he is one of my clients. And so I do a lot of work for him, not just writing. So that's a little bit about me. In terms of what we're going to talk about tonight, op-ed writing, I have done a ton of op-ed writing, both personally under my own name, but also as a ghostwriter. And one of the things that I love to do is to hear a story, put that story down on paper, and then get it published. So I love what we're going to walk through tonight, because I feel like a lot of times the voices of people of color, the voices of youth, it is missing from opinion pages. And if it's missing, then the public does not have a full perspective. So I'm 100% vested in what we're going to talk about tonight. So just so that I know you a little bit better and I understand your needs, if you have ever written and published an opinion essay, if you'll just take a moment and write in the chat feature, yes or no. So Monica, what kind of responses are we getting? Your line is muted.
Sorry, we're getting about 50-50.
50-50.
About half have, half haven't.
Okay, all right, great. And then when you hear the word reporter, I'm curious to know what one word comes to mind. If you could put that in the chat feature as well, I'd love to know that. When you hear the word reporter, what word comes to mind?
Deadline. We're getting a lot of deadline. Busy, angle.
Angle, okay. What else?
Message, news, spin, research, story, prickly.
Somebody said white supremacy.
Oh, white supremacy.
Misrepresentation, controversial.
Misrepresentation. Yeah.
Propaganda, control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Journalist agenda.
Okay, and let's just do one more. I'm curious to know when was the last time you had a media interview? So if it's never, put never, but tell me the last time that you engaged with the press and you were on the record, you did a media interview. Just really curious about that. Put that in the comments section.
A few weeks ago, last week, about 2 weeks ago, never. Many years ago, last week, last summer, a year ago.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to know a little bit about what you think when you hear reporters, so that I understand like information that I need to share with you. And then it's also helpful from a media standpoint, just for me to know the last time you had an interview. So at the conclusion of this training, what I want to do is I want to prepare you to write and to place opinion essays. And I want to increase the likelihood that when you write an opinion essay, that your essay will be published. I also want to help you hone your authentic voice and style. The way that I write is not the way that Kate writes. It's not the way that Monica writes. It's not the way that you write. And the beauty of opinion essays is it gives you an opportunity to find and to highlight your voice. One of the things that will increase the likelihood that you will be able to have a piece published is if it is unique. There are 57 of us on this call, and if all 57 of us write the same thing or say the same thing, only one of us will be published. So the idea is really to find your voice, to share your voice, and to bring something unique to the conversation. So I know next week is the anniversary of Parkland, and you guys are going to go through a conversation around messaging. I'm hopeful that as you write, each of you will lift up something different. And then you're going to increase the likelihood that you're going to see several op-eds, several blog posts about the anniversary. So when you leave this, you're going to feel like you're better prepared. I'm also going to give you op-ed contacts. And so part of the battle when you want to write an opinion essay is not knowing where to send that essay. So I went through some of my media list and I pulled out 24 different contacts from 24 different organizations. Maybe it's 18 different organizations because there are sometimes 2 people from one outlet. And I put them in a spreadsheet. I'll show you at the end of this presentation, but then I'll also make sure that Monica and Ali and Kate and Hashim, they have that Excel document and then they can share it with you. So that's just to get you started. Okay, so And I want to be mindful that we are doing interpretation. So if I need to slow down, I trust that someone will let me know, right?
Yeah, if it's going too fast, if you'll just chat in, we'll monitor the chat, and then we'll do the like sign that's like slow.
Okay. All right, great. So an opinion editorial, what is it? It's a guest column. And in terms of where it appears, if you're looking at an actual newspaper, if this is a newspaper, one half will be the editorial section. The other half will be the op-ed section. The editorial section represents the views of the publisher of the paper. The op-ed section, it's called op-ed because it is opposite to the editorial, and it represents the views of the public. So physically, in an actual newspaper, editorials are on one side, op-eds are on the other side. If you are on a website, or a digital media platform, if you go to the opinion section, sometimes you will see our take, and our take is the publication. And then you'll see guest op-eds or contributors or contributions or submissions, and that is the op-ed piece. That makes sense? Give me a yes or so in the, I get nervous when you guys don't talk to me, so if you could just put yes, you're following in the chat feature. Okay, so when we say op-eds or when we say opinion editorials, depending on where you're from, your background, you may say a variety of different things, but many of them mean the same thing. So other words for opinion editorials, some people say op-ed, some people say opinion piece, some people say opinion essay, and some people say guest column. All of these are the same thing. However, an op-ed is different from a blog post. A blog post tends to be less formal. It also tends to be shorter. So a blog post might be 350 to 500 words. An opinion essay or an opinion editorial is going to be longer. It's going to be 500 to sometimes 1,200 words, depending on the publication. So here are all the names. So if you're in a meeting with, a member of the press and they say opinion piece, we're all on the same page. So there's two ways to approach getting an opinion editorial placed. And by the way, if you guys want to write anything for Parkland, I recommend that as soon as we get off the phone tonight, you think about what you might say and where you might want to see it pitched or published, and you start working on it tomorrow so that it's submitted as soon as possible. So there's two ways to approach an opinion editorial. One way is you can just write the whole piece and you could submit it to the opinion editor of a publication. Another way is you can pitch a concept to the editor and then you can wait for feedback. And I don't really have a strong feeling one way or the other. Those are just two ways. Sometimes you can just go ahead and write it, and then other times you can pitch a concept. So for example, I've been on a media tour with Killer Mike. And one thing that I noticed is that as a result of this process, I've learned a lot about how to pitch a TV show. And so I reached out to a PR publication to say, hey, would you accept an op-ed on like the best tips for promoting a TV show? And so rather than me putting the effort into writing it, I first reached out to the editor to find out if he was even interested. Because he could have said, well, Jennifer, I ran something like this a month ago. And so he got back to me and said, yes, I'm willing to take a look. And that's how I'll approach that. In other situations, I just write the piece and publish it. So it really depends on what you want to do or what kind of relationship you have with the editor of a paper. If you want to get an opinion editorial published, you have to be timely. I heard from the op-ed editor at the Washington Post. His name is Michael Larrabee. Actually, I heard this third party. He relayed this to someone, but what he was sharing was that oftentimes publications, they are inundated with op-ed pieces. So you think about any given issue, and let's think about mass incarceration. There are so many people who want to see an end to mass incarceration. Imagine all of them sending an op-ed at one time. And what I heard is that a lot of times the Washington Post will accept the first well-written piece on a topic that they see. And the first could be within an hour after something happens. So you could take 4 days to produce, let's make it timely and relevant so that you follow. So 2 days ago, it was revealed the governor of Virginia that he had appeared in blackface in photos. And if you wanted to write an op-ed about that, as soon as that story broke, you really needed to be writing and submit it that night. And so what the information that I received is that the Washington Post will sometimes take the best and the first. And as soon as they get the first, they publish it. And so if it takes you 7 days to perfect your piece because you feel like we're shooting for perfection, you may not get the piece published. Not that it's not good, but it's possible the paper, they already have what they want. So I like to tell people to write it within 24 hours of a corresponding news story if you want to get it published. Or if you know there's an anniversary coming up, you want to write it and you want to get it to the editor as soon as possible. I'll give you an example. So last year, I wanted to get an op-ed piece published on Mother's Day. And what I wanted to think about is mothers who had children who were incarcerated. And at the time, my son was incarcerated. And a lot of people, when they think of Mother's Day, they think of celebration. But I wanted to lift up, for some mothers, it's a hard day. And so we know that Mother's Day is May 11th. And I started reaching out to, I published this in CNN, but I started reaching out to them in mid-April because I wanted to find out, I wanted to get to them before they had a concept. And I wanted to get to them before anybody else got to them. They loved the idea. I wrote the piece, and it took 3 weeks for the holiday to appear, but they published the piece on the holiday. So you either want to write it within 24 hours of a corresponding news story, or if you know there's an anniversary coming up, you want to get it to them as early as possible. Now, sometimes things happen and you just can't, you don't have a month lead time. That's okay. If the issue is important to you, write it anyway, and then just give yourself enough time to pitch multiple outlets if one outlet says no. You also want to pick a strong news hook. And what I mean by news hook is one way to get op-eds published is to write it about something that's currently being discussed. So, you know, there's a lot dominating the news cycle right now, the State of the Union. Next week, it's going to be Parkland. The Liam Neeson's comments about wanting to hurt, and I'm not going to say what he said, but wanting to hurt a Black person, right? Those are some stories that are in the news cycle. If you waited until a month from now to submit an op-ed on what Liam Neeson said, that's too late. So it has to be tied to what's in the news cycle. Another way to increase the likelihood that your op-ed is going to be published is give it context and give it texture. And when I say give it context, don't just state what's happening. Put what's happening in context in terms of what has happened in the past and what is going to happen in the future. And then give it texture. By give it texture, what I mean is it can't just be all opinion. You have to link to some reports. You have to reference some facts. You have to give some data. So it needs to be hard-hitting opinion. It needs to be fact. An unusual or unsuspecting element might be helpful, but it needs to be more than just, I don't like this because of X, Y, and Z. So like for Liam, if I were going to write about what he said, I would say, you know, not only is what he said inherently racist, a lot of times before violence takes place, a person ruminates on that violence in their mind, and then the thought becomes an action. And then I would include research that backs up that thinking. Before we ever do something, we think about it, and it's in our heart. There's like a biblical scripture that says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And what that means is when you've been feeling something for a while, at some point you're going to spit it out. Long way of saying, when you're writing, give context and tell people why it's important. Don't assume they're going to connect the dots for them. You also want to tell the public something they don't know. And so give some information that maybe people in the movement know, but maybe the public doesn't know. And if people feel like they're learning something, if op-ed editors feel like you are going to share and inform, they're more likely to publish what you have to say. You also want to follow submission guidelines. And what I mean by that is every publication has a set of rules for what they want to see in their op-eds. I was pitching a piece to HuffPost about an issue, and HuffPost had gone through some transitions at their opinion section, and they wanted a long form piece. And they said no to this person I was working with because the piece was too short. So follow the submission guidelines and you'll know exactly what people are expecting and what they want to see.
Jennifer, based on that, we do have a question around, did you pitch to multiple sources at the same time?
Say that again?
Should you pitch to multiple sources at the same time?
I do, and I do that if I'm pressed for time. So like for Parkland, I might pitch to 2 people. And if I'm going to do that, I give the paper a heads up. You know, hey, I would love to see this on the pages of the Washington Post. If I don't hear from you tomorrow, I may have to send it to another outlet. And then sometimes, sometimes I will call an op-ed editor to just say, you know, I really want to see this in your pages. Do you have time to look at it and tell me if it's at all of interest? And then if they don't respond, then I might send it to someone else. Okay, so a lot of times.
Sorry, Jennifer, real quick, before
Yeah.
can you just explain real quick what a news hook is?
Sure. So a news hook is basically what grabs, so when editors produce stories, they need to tie it to something that's happening. And a news hook is the way to tie it to something that's happening. The question that journalists ask is, why now and why should anyone care? The news hook tells people why they should care. So it is, it's a way to capture attention.
Thanks.
Okay. So a lot of times when you're doing coalition work or movement work, you're working in partnership and you're working in coalition. And there's a natural desire to want to have multiple signers on an opinion piece. And what I say is most publications prefer 1 signer. And sometimes they will accept 2, but I have rarely seen publications accept 3 signers. And by signers, like the people who have authored the op-ed. And if you're going to use 2 signers, pick unconventional partners, people who are unlikely to be, people who maybe agree on an issue, but they agree for different reasons. Or for example, if you're going to use multiple signers, and let's say you're doing your work in Colorado, but you're working with a national organization, you can consider having 1 signer be someone who is local, especially if you want the op-ed published in your local paper, and then 1 signer who is national. I was doing some work on the school to prison pipeline with the team at Advancement Project several years ago, and the lawyers who were working on the case, they had just done a beautiful job with the organizers in Colorado, and we wanted to write an op-ed, and so had this idea that we should get the executive director of Padres and also the executive director of Advancement Project to co-sign the piece. And we wanted the piece to be placed in the Denver Post. And that's what we did. And then for that same campaign, we wanted to ensure that people knew this was a national issue. So we also placed an op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution using 1 signer, and that person happened to be local to that community. So the long and short is you can have multiple signers, but if you have multiple signers, usually it can only be 2. And I recommend that you try to find people who are either unconventional partners or people who represent the geography for a topic that you're discussing. Okay, so submission guidelines. I'm just gonna move your faces over. Can you guys see me dragging the cameras? No? Okay, all right, good. All right, so every publication has different rules. That's why it's good to check the submission guidelines. The way you can find submission guidelines if you're on a website is 1, you can Google submission guidelines and then type in the publication. That's one way. So if I wanted to find the submission guidelines for the New York Times, I might just type in Google submission guidelines or op-ed submission guidelines for New York Times. That's one way to find it. Another way to find the submission guidelines is to click, if you're online, click on the opinion section of the publication and then scroll all the way to the bottom and then just see if it's there. Some publications want pieces that are 500 to 750 words. And then others want long form essays that are 1,000 words or more. Many publications, they don't like personal opinion. They want a mix of personal opinion and facts. And some, their submission guidelines even say that they don't want to see ableist language. So if you've ever produced or gotten an op-ed published in Truth Out, they have a whole document on ableist language, and they really hate it, and they will not publish your piece if it has ableist language in it. So that was kind of interesting, and I applaud them for taking that stand. A lot of papers are now asking that you include links to back up some of your claims. So if you say, you know, I personally believe that anxiety and depression under the current administration has like skyrocketed. If I say that in an op-ed, I need to be able to link to someone who is saying that and someone who is important, you know, like the American Psychological Association or the American Medical Association. I can't just make that claim. I have to back up why I'm saying that. Any questions in the chat box?
Yeah, back to the previous slide about who can be considered a signer besides the author.
What's the question?
Who can be considered a signer besides the author? So I think you probably said signer in exchange with author, and maybe like explaining both the differentiation and then.
When I say a signer, the signer is the author. So I mean, who has the byline, and the byline is who it's from, you know? So when an op-ed is published, it's like, okay, Monica Cordova wrote this piece, right? So that when I say signer, what I really mean is the person who is getting the piece published under their name.
Does that answer the question, folks?
Any other questions?
That's all we have right now. Yes.
Okay, great. So the bottom line is for submission guidelines, it's very important to check to see if they're available first. And then if they are, try to follow them as most as possible, because once you've invested the time to write, you really want to make sure that your writing speaks to what the publication wants. The other thing that I've noticed here recently is that some papers are explicitly asking, hey, did your PR person write this? Or we don't accept pieces written by a PR person. I was pitching something to the Hill, and before the Hill would consider the essay, they wrote back to say, we need to confirm this was not written by a PR person, but the person who you're saying wrote it actually wrote it. And fortunately, that was a case where I did not write it. And so I was able to respond in the affirmative, yes, so-and-so wrote it. But I'm seeing that happening. Some publications also prefer original content. They want content that was written specifically for their audience. They don't want you to have written a piece and to have shopped it around to 5 different places, and now you're sending it to them. And I think one of the reasons they don't want that is because what happens if one of the places that you sent it ends up running it or ends up using some of the content? So some publications will flat out ask, has this been submitted to any other place? Truth Out is one of the publications that will ask that. Most publications will tell you exactly what they're looking for in the submission guidelines. And I included in this deck a helpful piece in the New York Times about how to submit an op-ed. And the New York Times even walks through, this is what we want to see in the op-eds that we're going to publish. So when you see the presentation deck, you'll be able to see this link, and that should be helpful. So there are basically 3 different ways that I could think of that you can, to get an opinion essay published. So you can pitch the opinion editor or the editorial page editor. And the editorial page editor, remember the editorials represent the views of the publisher. The editorial page editor supervises the opinion editor. And the opinion editor is the person who decides whether or not they're going to publish your piece. So one way to get an op-ed published is to send it to the opinion editor, ask them if they'll publish it, or the editorial editor. I recommend you go with the opinion editor. Another way to get an op-ed piece published is through an editorial board meeting. And I always knew this was possible, but this was like a pleasant surprise. Last year, I did an editorial board meeting with a group called Live Free. And Live Free is actually a campaign of faith and action. And Live Free, they focus exclusively on ending gun violence in communities of color, and also on ending ending the mass incarceration system. So Live Free, like many of you, were watching all of the coverage of, the Parkland students, and we commend them for their bravery. But what they said is, listen, there are groups who are working in the community and they have evidence-based solutions of ways to reduce gun violence. You need to be listening to all of our voices. So we went in, we met with the Washington Post editorial board. I took Live Free is all over the country. I brought in a guy who had been a victim of gun violence to tell his own story. And he lived in an urban community. He was not a part of a mass shooting, but he had been shot, just a part of urban gun violence. And so we brought him in. I think in total, we probably had maybe 6 people with us. We did the editorial board meeting. And by the way, I don't recommend taking that many people to an editorial board meeting, but it happened. So we did the editorial board meeting. The very next day, the editorial page editor emailed to say, do you guys have an op-ed on this? And we said, yes. We said yes as we were writing, furiously. And they published the op-ed. But not only did they publish the op-ed, they flew a video crew to Oakland, California to follow the leader around. And if you click on this op-ed, you'll see there's the op-ed and there's also a really nice video. And that was the first time in my career that an op-ed was turned into a video. So that's another way, is through an editorial board meeting. Another way is the paper could reach out to you, or the publication could reach out to you to say, hey, we want to hear your opinion on this. Sometimes when this happens, the paper could publish a story on, let's say the paper publishes a story on the importance of background checks, universal background checks. And let's say their viewers react harshly to the story and they start putting in a bunch of negative comments. Sometimes a publication will go to people who they know work in that area and say, hey, can you write an op-ed on this? This happened last week, and I included the link of an article, but there was an anti-abortion law that was passed, I think in North Carolina, and Religion News Service reached out because they wanted to hear the perspective of people of faith who believe in reproductive justice. And they invited this group to write an op-ed. So long story short, and I have a story for everything, you guys should know that I can always find a story, but long story short, there's 3 ways to land an op-ed. You could pitch the editor, you could be invited to write one, or you could do an editorial board meeting, and either you can request or they can ask.
Jennifer, we have a question that is, do publications confirm with you that they will publish it?
Most of the time they do. Most of the time they do. And I've had a few situations where I've only had one situation in the past 2 years where a paper has said, yes, we're going to run it, and they don't. I had pitched something to the Guardian, an editor got back to me and said, yes, we're going to run it. The news cycle changed, and she never ran the piece, and she never closed the loop with me. So, but most of the time they will tell you, we're going to run this piece. Now they may say we're going to run this piece, and they could say, you know what, we're going to run this on February 13. But depending on what happens in the news cycle, it could be pushed back to February 16. So yes, 9 times out of 10, they will tell you. And sometimes even they don't have control over when it runs based on what else is happening in the news cycle. So what other stories are happening?
And will they tell you, if you submit something online, will they tell you that they're not going to publish it?
If they tell you they're not, you should count yourself lucky, because a lot of people just don't respond.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, sometimes they just don't.
Sometimes they just don't respond. A lot of times they don't respond. When someone reaches out and says no, I'm like, thank you, because at least I know and I can move on. it's like you're being ghosted by the editors, and that, you know, it doesn't feel good to be ghosted, but you definitely don't want to be ghosted by the media. So I always appreciate if they tell me no. Any other questions?
No, that's all.
Okay. All right. So this is an example of the third way that I mentioned. And in this example, this editor of Religion News Service reached out to tell me about this bill that passed. And he knew that I had done some training work for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And he basically said, hey, this anti-abortion measure passed. Would RCRC, and he got their name wrong, but I knew what he was talking about, but he said, would RCRC be willing to write a piece? I said, absolutely, you know, and I reached out to their team. She took it from there, and the piece was published. So the piece in the deck is the one that was published. So let me give you a few best practices when you're writing. And this is not on here, but you don't feel like you have to be the best writer to write an op-ed. What you have to be is clear on your position, but you don't have to be the best writer. You have to just be able to get your writing on paper. A lot of times we struggle with wanting to be perfect, and that struggle with wanting to be perfect will prevent us from actually getting the thoughts on paper. I always tell people, as an editor, if you put the words on the paper, I can clean it up. I can take out the typos. I can think about some ways to connect the language. But if you do the hard work of just getting those thoughts out, you're halfway there. You're actually more than halfway there. So other best practices is you want to mix opinion with facts, and then you want to back up those facts with links. Put the links right in the article. So if you say Donald Trump Jr. is no good, put in a link to a report that says that it's been proven that of all human beings in the universe, Donald Trump Jr. is no good. Now, that doesn't exist, but I'm just saying. Put that link right in there, because what you do when you do that is you prevent the paper from having to go and do the research. So you just want to make it really easy for them. You also want to say something that no one else is saying and no one else is doing. And that goes back to the point I made at the beginning. If all 57 of you say the same thing, only one of you is going to get published. But if you can find a different spin on the same story, then maybe several of you will get published. If you want to say that something is wrong, be the first person to say it. You know, it's like with the governor of Virginia, and I am talking to you from Virginia. I'm pretty upset about it, like many of you. But if I were going to comment on that story, I need to say something that no one else has said, or either I need to be the first person saying that he's wrong. And then if you can infuse history, that's good too, because, you know, most publications want to feel like their readers are going to learn something as a result of what you are sharing. The last one is sometimes hard, but you have to avoid self-promotion. Journalists don't want to, and publications, they don't want to feel like they're publishing a piece that's just a marketing piece, right? You can pay for marketing. So when I say avoid self-promotion, don't keep mentioning your organization in the op-ed piece. You know, be careful that it doesn't come across as though it's a commercial. So try to avoid self-promotion. The idea is to get your issue out there, to have that name and that byliner, and then once it's published, you can take that op-ed and you can share it with funders, you can share it with people in the movement. In other words, you can do the self-promotion later. Any questions on anything on this sheet?
No, but we have somebody that's hopping off and they're wondering if you could share your contact info if we have further questions.
Sure.
We're going to have, and then we'll drop it now. Can somebody drop it now? For folks that won't follow up, well, we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But for folks that are really interested in writing something, we have a survey that folks can fill out and we can assess if we can support you.
Great. So let me just share a few quick media tips, and then I'll take any other questions, and then Monica, I'll kick it back to you guys so that you can go over the messaging. So for op-ed editors and then for reporters, you want to cultivate relationships before you need them. Like if I'm going to ask you, Kate, to borrow $20, I would like to have had a conversation with you before, right? Because that could be kind of weird. You know, hey, Kate, after this call, I want you to call me because I need $20. That could be strange. We don't want to do that. So the same thing with reporters. Reporters are people. They have feelings. They have good days, they have bad days, and you want to try to engage them in relationship before you need them. And you could say, well, Jennifer, how do we do that? You can invite them to an event. If they write an article and you like their take, or they have an analysis on social media and you like it, you could say, you know what, I appreciate this feedback. You want to send short, pithy statements. You also want to understand on the record and off the record. And what I mean by that is, if you walk into an interview with a reporter and you start talking and then you say, wait a minute, that's off the record, meaning you can't quote it, that does not apply. You have to say, can this conversation be off the record? Get them to agree before it is literally off the record. You want to pick a couple points, main points that you want to underscore. This is important in op-eds, but it's also important in interviews. Sometimes in op-eds, people put all the issues in one document, and it's really hard for the person on the other end to read it. If you're writing an op-ed, cover one issue, maybe two. But if you bog everything down in one 750 page or 750 word document, it's confusing and you decrease the likelihood it's going to be covered. So pick one issue and then focus on that. If you're in a face-to-face, pick maybe two to three and focus on that. So where do you want to place your opinion essay? A lot of times when we write, we want the validation of having it appear on a mainstream paper, or either we want as many people to see it as possible. We think, well, okay, if I can just get the New York Times to publish it, that'd be great. But I think that we should think of our websites as a great tool to place essays as well, because you control your website, right? And once you put it on your website, you can then share it with everyone on this list. You can share it with your network. You can share it with the media. You should also look into medium.com. The publishing platform on medium.com, it's just getting better and better. And even now, there's a way that if you start publishing a lot on Medium and people begin to like you, Medium will actually pay you for it. So I encourage people to think of Medium. You can obviously go to a third-party platform, and a third-party platform could be, asking one of your partner organizations to post your piece there. Or you can do the media website, which is how this conversation originated. My point in saying is that if a publication does not publish your piece, rather than not getting the idea out there, you have other options. You can publish it on your website. You can take it to Medium. Anybody can have an account on Medium, or you can send it to one of the partner organizations. But you have options. You don't have to hold that think piece in. You can publish it one way or the other. So if this has been helpful, feel free to follow me on Twitter and IG, and my handle is pr_whisperer.com.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Oh,
yeah, let me just share one more thing. So this is the Word doc, and I'm going to email it to the organizers of this call, and they can get it to you, or the Excel document. And this just has some contacts for different op-ed editors. So I've got CNN on here. I've got the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, Politico, LA Times, The Hill, Rewire, Time, USA Today, and the Washington Post. So quite a few I think there are like 24 on this list, and you guys are welcome to add to this, customize it, make it your own, and then share it with the group.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. That was great. We have a little bit of time. So if folks have questions now, please chat them in. And I think we can take some specific questions for Jennifer now before we move on. So one is, what happens after the op-ed? How do you respond when people attack you or troll you? How do you balance being vulnerable with writing the op-ed?
That's a great question. And I don't think that you should get into a public spat over, like, if someone is trolling you, you don't need to fight back with them, right? It can be a one-sided conversation. Now, if they're saying that you put out inaccurate information or false information, you want to defend the credibility of yourself and the credibility of your organization. But you don't need to get into a back and forth, because I've seen those things escalate, and the person who was initially attacked, they end up getting in trouble because our emotions get high, and when our emotions are high, we can say the wrong thing. But once that op-ed is published, that is the beginning. And the reason that I say it's the beginning is because once that op-ed is published, you should be sharing it with your network. You should share it with reporters who you want to meet with. You should share it with reporters as a way to frame your issue or your topic. So let's say you're going to go in and meet with a reporter. Send them your op-ed on an issue, and that way they know where you stand, and it's a good way to frame the conversation. A lot of times when you see articles and reporters make mistakes, sometimes they don't make those mistakes out of malicious reasons. Sometimes they just don't know enough about the issue. And so once you write that op-ed, save it, and then share it with reporters to help them understand your issue and where you're coming from. Share it with funders so that funders see that you're out there. Share it with one another, and you guys can cross promote. Share it on all your social media platforms, and not just one time, right? Like we put it out there, we hit, go. Share it over and over and over again, because you want to make sure that people actually have an opportunity to see it. And then the other thing is, a lot of times things happen, like they're cyclical, right? So right now we're talking about the governor of Virginia. We're talking about the State of the Union. There are going to be other incidences like this where even it may be a year or two, but your op-ed will still be relevant. So just because you wrote an op-ed on blackface or what have you a year ago does not mean that you can't tie it to the current conversation. You should also tweet it at reporters who you want. So when you publish an op-ed, that's not a slam dunk, like we can't put our feet up. That is the time to then take it and then elevate it.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What is some advice for smaller local papers? How does an author or org get in with the op-ed editor? A number of my pieces don't get published, but the local paper is known to be conservative and selective, especially on issues pertaining to communities of color.
So if the paper is known to be conservative and they don't want to share a balanced perspective, there's only so much you can do. Sometimes when an op-ed editor, if an op-ed editor is kind enough to tell me no, sometimes I will ask them why. Because once I know the why, then I can tweak the essay, assuming that there aren't any other issues. So for instance, me and my team tried to get a piece published in the Washington Post. It was a really good piece. I mean, the woman who wrote it, she wrote the hell out of that piece, if I can say so. It was just beautiful, right? And the Washington Post said no. And I kept thinking, why? And so I just reached out to the editor and I said, listen, I appreciate all feedback. I really want to get better. Where did we miss the mark with this piece? And he said, you know what? It's a great piece. It's well written, but we knew what we were going to write about this topic a week ago. And you sent it to me 2 days before, so I couldn't use it.
Do we have any other questions for Jennifer?
Yeah, I got one. Jennifer, we had a question that came in that went back to what you were saying about not doing self-promotion. And so we had a question of, what if someone is just kind of talking about their experience and they're addressing the issue and that's happening through the organization? Is mentioning the organization in that case considered self-promotion and something people shouldn't do?
No, because that's just offering context and that's just sharing information. When I say self-promotion, if every paragraph of your op-ed is about what you've done and how great you are, that is self-promotion and it's not going to get published. If you have several references to your organization in the piece, that's iffy. So you can talk about your experience because your experience is what makes you an expert in the issue, but it's how you talk about that. So like, I asked you guys to follow me on Twitter, and if I wrote an op-ed and I talked all about my credentials and, I encourage you to engage with me, that would not be an op-ed, that would be a promotion piece. So talking about your experience, you should do, because that credentials you, it sets you apart. And papers want to know that they're publishing subject matter experts, but it's when you keep making the repeated references to yourself, as in, the Funders Collaborative did this and the Funders Collaborative did this. After about that third time, and I'm being facetious because 3 is too many, 1 is probably okay.
Great, thank you. Did anybody else receive any questions, or does anybody else have any last questions before we move on? No. Okay. So what we want to do is both keep in mind what Jennifer has echoed to us around, we don't want 57 of the same exact stories, but we did feel like this was also an opportunity for us to share some of our initial thinking around messaging or frames. And so we're going to preview some messaging and frames as an offering, and also this is a part of a larger, these will be part of a larger toolkit that's actually still in development that will drop early next week. But we did want to preview some of them if folks needed some sort of launching ground or way to get your juices flowing because you're trying to think about your op-ed. And of course, we always want you to represent your local context in your work. So for this, I'm gonna bring in some of our partners. Again, this is a collaborative effort of FCYO, of Communities for Just Schools Fund, Advancement Project, CPD, Alliance for Educational Justice, and who am I missing? I'm missing, Power California. So we're gonna bring in some of our partners, and they're pulling from various pieces that folks have put out, but we're gonna share some examples. And I'm gonna actually now turn it over to, as I share my screen, I'm gonna turn it over to Gina from AP to kick us off. And I'll get your slide up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Let me try to get the slide up. There we go.
Perfect. Let me just move us. Hi, everyone. So my name is Gina Physic. I am a senior communications associate with the Advancement Project National Office based in DC. And just to piggyback off of what we've just gone over, again, we want to reiterate, not all of these pieces need to be the same, but we have messaging and resources and tools that we're helping to provide you guys with just to make sure that we're inserting ourselves into this national narrative in a meaningful way that is cohesive. So, and if you happen to be taking notes, again, don't try to get everything down. This is all information that we will be sharing with you guys following the webinar. But the talking points that we have prepared are bits and pieces of information that you may already be familiar with. The content is aggregated from a number of different resources, toolkits, reports. Majoritively, I would say the No Cops, No Guns campaign resources that AP has produced, the We Came to Learn report, which some of you may be familiar with, and then a bit of information called 6 Things You Need to Know About School Policing. And on the next slide, I'm just going to go over a few talking points that are just samples and walk you guys through that. So we have background information on Parkland, right? So on February 14th, 2018, a gunman opened fire on Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, located in Parkland, and claimed the lives of 17 students and school staff. And so since that tragic day, we know that the nation has heard reactions and responses from families of the victims and concerned students across the country demanding solutions that honor those whose lives were lost. We know that following the incident, communities called on their legislators. We know that school administrators were brought in. Conversations addressing gun violence became more and more prominent. And in addition to conversations about gun violence, the Parkland shooting sparked a dialogue about mental health, safety, police in schools, and the alarming move to arm school faculty. And what all of this really bubbles up to is this key point, and that it's all of this conversation is to the detriment of Black and brown students, right? So this national conversation, this national discourse really fails to acknowledge that an increase in police and guns in our schools harshly impacts young people of color. And so these are points that we want to make sure you guys have available to you as you begin to write, so that you can shape your language in a way that helps to really underscore these things so that they become a part of the national discourse and can be elevated to that national discourse as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Alicia, and she's going to walk through some further messaging.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Olivares, she, her, hers. I am the policy director with Power California. If we could skip to the next slide, please. So for us, I want to give a huge shout out to Genesis Gonzalez from Active Women and Girls in Woodlake and Visalia, who started her op-ed this past weekend. And so I'll share a little bit of how we structured ours. And so, yeah, jumping into that, how we started it was really acknowledging that Parkland was a movement where nationally we saw young people and their leadership elevated from walkouts to, you know, public sessions where they're holding folks accountable, elected officials accountable. And so acknowledging that, but then really moving into this piece around centering the framework around young people of color and how it built off the work that young people of color have been doing around gun violence in school and community safety for years. And so in that context, we also, we had a little bit of a different framing in the sense that we lifted up school safety in the context of sanctuary schools. So they had been working on a local campaign for the last couple of months to get their local unified school board to designate their campuses under a safe haven policy that would protect undocumented students, and also to fight for some pieces around protecting LGBTQ students too. And they won. And so we really use that also to lift up kind of the direct skills and experience in leadership that Genesis got from that campaign. So we talked about her learning to organize her friends, canvass the community, speak at board meetings, negotiating with their superintendent, voter registration drives. Again, really continuing this narrative of demonstrating the ways in which young people have stepped up in their communities to organize for safe schools and communities. We did connect that back up to just efforts that have been happening across California around youth organizing, just to kind of bring it in to a larger context. And then lastly, we closed it with really regrounding kind of the work in the meaning of today, right? If this comes out on the actual anniversary, and then also the work going forward, right? So we talked about today is a day of honoring those young people who lost their lives, and also the ways in which we could lift up this memory to really going forward to continue to ensure that our schools and communities are safe and just for all. So that was just one example. And of course, I know folks are working on a lot of different school safety or community safety campaigns. But yeah, I wanted to share that and shout out to Genesis for working on that already.
Thanks. Thank you both. So again, folks, these are just examples of the ways in which that, you know, you can think about your op-eds. The folks in Alicia and Genesis, the folks in California are already working on their piece. They have something already that they're working on, and this was kind of their template. And I know several other folks are working on pieces. So we also, we're gonna have a toolkit come out with tweets. So the other thing that we're really hoping folks do is help us create an echo chamber. And so we have some sample tweets, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk a little bit about the social media presence that we're hoping to have next week.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Monica. Kate from the Center for Popular Democracy. And as we've shared throughout this, the most important piece is lifting up all of your voices and the work that's happening and sort of creating really connecting all of those stories and work that's happening across the country to intervene in the national narrative around this. So that's true in the op-eds, that taking your own perspective and sharing your own voice and message that you want to get across is really important. And it's true in social media. So as Jennifer mentioned, you know, if an op-ed goes out, being sure to tweet that op-ed, share it broadly, and get the story out broadly on social media, and join in the conversation with some of these kind of shared messages or your own plays off of some of the sample tweets that we put together to guide some of that conversation. So here are just a few samples, and we'll be, again, sending these more broadly so that you have time to plan for it in advance for the anniversary. But the first one is just an example of how the work can tie into some of what's happening federally. So as many of you know, after the Parkland tragedy, Donald Trump put together a commission to study school safety, and their recommendations were really harmful and would increase the police presence and criminalization of young people of color. So this tweet brings that up and directs people to read more through the We Came to Learn report that Gina had mentioned, and links together with the hashtags youth demand, police free schools. There's also counselors not cops, and others that Parkland, no guns, no police, that we can, those hashtags tie together the story across multiple organizations and multiple people so that people can follow along with the conversation that we're creating. The next one is just facts. Like if a piece that you really want to raise is the facts of what's coming out, it's that studies show that schools are no safer even after years of punitive policing and discipline than before those policies are implemented. That cops, metal detector surveillance don't make students safe. So similar to the op-eds, the social media is just backing up the same narrative that all of you have shared across the country and in your local campaigns. And you can share resources. Here we have an example from a report that was written with Urban Youth Collaborative in New York City that backs up those facts, and you can do that with your local campaigns too, to share what you've said on this before. And then these final two are about kind of what you're demanding. So these are youth demands that young people have put together from all different organizations and have kind of aligned on some of these demands. And also, as you're putting it out, you should lift up your local campaigns and say, you know, these are the demands that we're sharing locally that are important in this moment to show that policing and militarizing schools as a response to school safety won't work, and this is what we're calling for instead. These youth demands we'll be sharing so that there's, you all see some of the ones that have come together across different organizations, but they're all echoing what we've heard from each of our partner organizations, just to get this narrative that this is really what young people want, and the vision of youth of color and the expertise of them in their schools is what people all across the country need to be paying attention to. And so the tweets will echo that, and we really encourage, you'll see in some of the sample tweets, if you can go to the next slide maybe, to use some graphics too. There's been a bunch of research that if there's a graphic associated with a picture, either from your community, or we'll be sharing graphics that we'd love for people to get out far and wide, that people are much more likely to click on that, to reshare it. It's visually appealing. So please be sure to include some pictures of yourself, of your community, or of the graphics that we share to get the most engagement that we can on that day and lift it up most broadly.
Great. Thank you. So we have a little bit of space for questions, but before we do, I don't want to lose the opportunity because I see folks are starting to drop off to, Allie, will you drop in the Google survey? So we do have some capacity, not like, you know, if all 43 of you decided you wanted to write an op-ed, we don't have that level of capacity, but we do have some capacity both from the organizations who are collaborating on this effort and a little bit from Jennifer to support folks that want to write an op-ed for the anniversary next week. I think the thing that we're asking for folks, if you're really interested in doing that, please fill out the survey. We will need folks to be able to turn something around by Friday. And so our team is we're regrouping tomorrow to kind of figure out who's filled out the survey, who has interest, if you have media contacts, and then figuring out who can connect with who to help folks move that process along. So again, in the chat box, there's a Google Form survey. If you're interested in writing an op-ed and getting help with the placement or possibly help with editing, please fill that form out, and then our team will loop back with you. So we hope that you've learned something from this space and can take that and run with it. And then if you need additional support, please put that in there. And then if you're all good on your own, please, if you get something that gets published, let us know. And we'll put our some of our email addresses in the chat box as well. Let us know so then our organizations can reshare them. And then I see the eval is already up. So we still have time for questions, but also if you can fill out the evaluation in our poll, that would be helpful. So do folks have any additional questions on the messaging, on what's coming up next? Questions for Jennifer? We will be sharing the slides, the contact list that Jennifer put up of media folks, and we'll be with those that registered for this, as well as making sure to send you all the toolkit next week. So those resources will be available. But I wanted to open it up. Are there any questions on the messaging? Are there any other questions folks have? Are others getting direct questions? Because I know Hashi, maybe you've gotten some of you.
Can folks hear us?
Yes.
Hi, this is Kitsia from San Francisco, California. I'm here with a couple of our members. Thank you so much for slowing down for interpretation. I had a question regarding sharing resources. I think it's helpful to have the tweets to kind of have a sense of the what we recommend people to tweet the day of. But if anyone gets published, it would also be helpful for those to be linked in the tweets, so that that like larger messaging can get spread out. And I was hoping to figure out a way that we can have like a shareable version of the things that get published, especially in online publications.
Mm-hmm. If you follow, not shameless, Ellie, I was going to get to it. If all of us can drop in our hand, so like if you follow any of our organizations, Communities for Just Schools Fund, AP, FCYO, Power California, I'm sorry, I'm talking fast. Follow all of the networks that are on here, both on Facebook and on Twitter. You'll definitely be able to see what's happening throughout that day and retweet us. And we'll probably, because we're connected to so many organizations, we'll be retweeting out everything. And so that's one easy way to do it, is just follow all of our organizations on social media if you don't already. And then the hashtag Youth Demand Parkland, we'll be using a lot of those. And Ali, do you want to say something? So also, Communities for Just Schools Fund is having a webinar on the anniversary date. Ali, do you want to say a little bit about it? Are you on, Ali? Yeah.
Hey, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, y'all, this is Ali. I'm the program assistant with Communities for Just Schools Fund. Remember to speak slowly. Yes, we are holding a webinar. I know that doesn't sound terribly sexy, but we really want to lift up, some of the amazing reports and work that was done by organizations, many of whom are on this call, following the Federal Commission on School Safety and responding to their harmful recommendations, the decision to rescind the federal guidance on school discipline, and just unpacking, what that means, but also lifting up the work that organizations on this call are doing every day to model and redefine what truly safe and supportive schools look like. I hope you will join us for that webinar. The link is in the registration page. Yes, the webinar will certainly be recorded and shared broadly. It will be a lot of information that a lot of you already know, but I would say this is a great space. If you have teacher allies or you have district folks that want to know more about the work you're doing or these networks, this is a great space to introduce them and to kind of start pulling more folks across our education, constituencies, and really get everybody on the same page about the fact that folks are really down for police-free schools, and radicalizing and reimagining what schools look and feel like. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Allie. So the Zoom link is in the chat. Please, that'll be on the actual date of the anniversary. So folks, please register for that. We have a question. I think, Jennifer, this is probably for you. How should organizations think about measuring the impact of an op-ed piece beyond just placement in the media?
Once the op-ed piece is placed, if it's placed online, you should look at the number of people who viewed it so that you could get a sense of like the impressions. That's one way to measure it. And then in the best case scenario, you want an op-ed to generate other media inquiries. So if you're writing op-eds and you're sharing it with your local press, but no one is asking to talk to you, you may have to be more aggressive in reaching out and saying, hey, can we talk about this issue? But I think when you get follow-up calls as a result of something that you've written, that's a good sign. When you can track the impressions, how many people saw the op-ed piece, that's a good sign when you're pushing it repeatedly on social media. And the thing is, like, it takes time to get to scale. So I would recommend that you write a piece and you keep writing. So like, we don't want to just write once. Next week, you want to keep writing. And when you get to a place where the op-ed editors and other folks are reaching out to you to say, hey, will you write on this? That's a good indication that, that what you're doing is working. So those are some ways that I think we can measure it.
Others, does anybody have any other questions? No other questions? Great. So as we close out, again, please fill out the evaluation. Let us know how we did on this webinar. 2, register for a Community for Just School Funds webinar. 3, we dropped in the chat the survey if you're actually interested in doing the work of writing an op-ed. Where several of us are here to help you with that. So if you're interested, please fill out that survey. And then 4, look out for our toolkit that we'll be emailing early next week. And then if you all need any additional support, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to continue to be in conversation with you. So from all of us, thank you all so much for spending part of your evening with us. Thank you to Jennifer. Thank you to all of the folks that have put in work. We really appreciate, folks spending part of their evening with us tonight, and we hope to continue to work with you through the next week and beyond. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.